Well, good morning, everyone. It's always my pleasure to play a little part in the program that we do, the Institute here. When I think about the Center for Faith and Culture, I'm always so excited at the work. And when I listen to Father Nesty, when I listen to Father Ben, and now listening to Tom, I think, oh, that is amazing. That is wonderful. That is fascinating. That's complex. What do you do? I'm very kind of pragmatic and concrete, and so I'm always trying to think, what does all of this mean in terms of some practical living or some practical steps? And so that's the focus of my piece. How can we take what we're hearing, and how can we take this challenge about participating and fostering and furthering the dialogue between faith and culture? How do we do that from a concrete or pragmatic lens? So that's my piece today. I wrote out a little review to be my running board to get us started. It's not on your stapled packet, but you should have that sheet. I passed them out at the table. So just to walk us in to the topic this morning, which is firewalls for our Catholic identity. I just want to say a phrase about each of these bullet points on this review sheet. I think one of the things that's clear that I try to keep in my mind is this whole call to developing identity as a person, developing identity as a person in Christ, developing identity as families, as parishes, as Catholics, as if you're Episcopalian or Methodist, that all of this, it's meant to be a gift. It's meant to be a wonderful opportunity, which I know you know in your head, but sometimes when we get into these conversations, we get into the struggle, the burden, the tension. And I just want to bring back to mind the tension, the struggle, is because we were given a great gift. And the way I like to think of it is, and this is what I say at night before I go to bed, thank you for giving me a turn. You know how when we're kids, can I have a turn? Can I have a turn? It's a great way to think of our lives as saying, I got a good turn. And the opportunity to develop our identity is our turn. Okay? And so we've been given this great gift, this opportunity to develop identity, a great turn. And that part of that identity, we've been saying, is our Catholicity. Or if you're Episcopalian or Methodist, whatever else would be your particular tradition that the Spirit has drawn you to, that is not our identity, but it is part of our identity, okay? So we're looking at developing that piece of our identity. We've also been talking then about that in today's culture, Catholic identity, or some would say religious identities, are at risk of being blotted out, lost, co-opted by cultural forces of our times. That's why we're here. We're talking about this identity that we love and cherish, that's been entrusted to us, is under siege in some ways in our culture with some of those forces that we wrote on the stones. And that, going now to yesterday's message, that like our ancestors in faith, our ancestors in Scripture, our ancestors in the church and in the development of church, that we're called to wrestle with these different forces. Father Nesty often uses the word voices, wrestle with these different voices individually and together, collectively, to discover and uncover our true identity, again, as individuals and as a body of Christ. So we come to today that our focus is going to be that dialogue and discernment are the wrestling skills. Because otherwise, we could, using the word wrestling a lot yesterday, does it mean we're going to, pump up and take it to the mat with people? Well, maybe, metaphorically, but wrestling skills, a good way to think about would be, I'm going to develop my dialogue muscles. I'm going to develop my discernment skills, because those are, we're looking for a word that fit the technology of the day. Those are the firewalls. You think about firewalls. First of all, sometimes you know how you're doing something and all of a sudden you try to, on the computer, and you try to do something, it says, can't go there, firewall. I think, is that good or bad? And who put it there? That's the other thing. Who put it there? Since I'm a little bit computer illiterate. But that firewalls are a way of protecting what's in our data bank, Something that, now if it's so rigid, something can't get through. You know how sometimes you're trying to access something and you have to disable the firewall? Because that's something you want to let in. Okay? But at the same time, you need to put it back, because otherwise you're going to get all this stuff about Viagra that you really don't want, right? Viagra plus, okay? So we need those firewalls. We need those firewalls. But I'm going to be imaging in my mind today that it's dialogue skills and discernment skills that end up being our firewall, something that protects us, but also something that allows what the Lord would want allowed in, so that what's inside me, what's inside us, can change and grow and become larger in life. Okay, so that's my walking into the topic today. So, firewalls for our Catholic identity. My faithful assistant, Cynthia. Okay, so if we're going to talk about dialogue, I thought we'd take a moment to just remind ourselves of probably the most important thing about dialogue, and that's its purpose. Welcome. Okay, so the purpose of dialogue. I think a lot of times in the course of our day, at least I don't often say, I'm going to go have a dialogue with somebody. I think, I'm going to go talk to them. And what does that usually mean? I'm going to go tell them what I think, I'm going to go tell them what I think. And what I'm suggesting is we start getting it in our heads that it's not the best approach to developing identity to just be using that word talk narrowly. I'm going to go talk to them and say, I'm going to go have a dialogue. Can you just sense how that would change your approach? Now, for me, it means I probably wouldn't go a lot of times. Because when I'm going to go have a talk with someone, I'm going to go tell them something often. And I might want to hear a little bit. But if I tell myself I need to have a dialogue with so-and-so, it really straightens me up and gets me thinking about the mystery that I am meant to open myself up to if I'm going to have a dialogue rather than a talk with somebody, okay? Because the purpose of dialogue is fitting with what we've been talking about this week, is to expand our horizons. When I go to have a dialogue with you, I'm hoping, or I'm committing myself to the idea that my horizon may need to change. That if we engage in this conversation, that your horizon will hopefully change. I'll see something I don't see. Maybe you'll see something you don't see. The togetherness of us may change the horizon of our way of thinking into a whole different way of thinking, and that some of what comes out of that, or a lot of what then would come out of that, is going to be out of our control. And I mean that in the mysterious, wonderful way. It might be a mess first, but it's going to take us into someplace new. Okay, so I think as we're talking about dialogue, faith, and culture, wrestling this, dialogue is not to tell somebody something alone or to get something, but to change our way of thinking. And so there you can see how dialogue is a spiritual practice. We talk about spiritual practices. Read the daily readings or read the Liturgy of the Hours. I think it's so important that we keep getting in our mind that dialogue is a spiritual practice, and see if we can commit to dialogue as much as we're constantly struggling to commit to that quiet time of prayer or that hour of silence, okay? So we dialogue to expand our horizons, to let God have a place to work. We dialogue to make room for love, to do what only love can do. Okay? Just go back to the title of the conference. identity theft and the dialogue Catholic Americans. If you think of it outside of this context, it seems like we better bulk up because we got to go meet the enemy. But if you think of it as we need to get better at talking, we need to get better at listening, we need to get better at dialoguing, because when we do, we can make room for love to do what only love can do. Does that make you have this sense, it puts the challenge in the larger perspective of the Holy Spirit renewing the earth. So it's not then about fixing. Dialogue is not about fixing. It's wonderful when we can get a sense of fix, but it's not about fixing. And it came to my mind in some of the things that we were talking about, and I heard about yesterday when all of our concerns about the church come up, and we're so frustrated with the church at times, and what do we do about the church, and how do you talk to them? And I think, well, maybe what we really need to do is learn how to suffer the church more gracefully, and learn how to talk and dialogue about what we're suffering so that we have a new experience of love. Does that make sense? Sometimes when in my own parish at times, and I think, oh my gosh, you just think I'm going to jump out of my pew here. Sometimes I think to myself, okay, something in my mind seems amiss here, whether it's the way the word is preached or the liturgy is prayed and shared or not shared or whatever. And I think to myself, I know something here needs to change. At least my horizon says something needs to change. But I try to remember this, and I know you do too, I think, but also does my capacity to suffer what I don't think is right or just or good need to be developed? Because as I sit here, I can wander to all the other places in life where people are not having a voice, don't have a sense of power, don't get to have the church be the way they want it to be. And love is growing then inside me in that experience of solidarity with others that helps me bring a different spirit to my pain and disappointment in the pew. Make sense? Okay, so that's what you do too. I always remember this woman that I met down in Brownsville years ago. She said, I was down there with a friend of mine who's a sister, and met some of the parishioners there. There's these two Hispanic women. They had worked in the church since they were born. And one of them said to me, oh, Maureen, this is what's going on in our church and that. And everyone had been criticizing the pastor. And this woman said she said, yeah, Father, we just know, Father doesn't know Christ yet. She said it with so much love and tenderness. She says, Father just doesn't know Christ yet, and we're just convinced that if we can just keep loving him and loving on him and all that, with time, God's going to help him have a conversion. And I thought, now there's a woman in dialogue. Okay, so anyhow, why are we focusing on dialogue? To expand our horizon, not to fix somebody, because we don't have that power to fix somebody, and the most important thing isn't fixing, the most important thing is loving. And loving takes us to painful places, on the process of freeing us. Okay, thanks, Cynthia. So, if we're going to talk about dialogue, these are some of the components of dialogue that might be helpful for us to think about. Maybe it's a little different way than you think about it, so you can engage me in some of your own comments on this. But, it seems like for a dialogue to happen, that there's got to be some bondedness, like a set of beliefs bonded together, a set of different ways of thinking, some values. There has to be some cohesiveness within an individual to be able to engage in telling a story, giving an opinion, okay? So a dialogue means that there's a certain amount of bondedness, a cohesive set of beliefs. It means that in that set of beliefs, there are probably some boundaries. Otherwise, it's not a set. You know what I'm saying? You have beliefs about things like, I believe a family should do this, this, and this. But then the boundary is, but it doesn't do this. Okay? There's what it is and what it's not. It's important. We've been talking about identity. With identity, there's a set of beliefs, and as part of that set of beliefs, there's a line of what's included and not. Okay? I'll give some examples in a minute. So boundaries are the lines between what I believe and do not believe, or what I believe and others believe. There's a distinctiveness. Okay? In a dialogue, there's bonds, there's boundaries, and then there's borders. Okay? So that there are things I believe, then there's things I don't believe, and then at the outset of things that I don't believe, there's a line. Like when you say to your kids, don't go there, don't go that far, don't cross that line. And what do your kids want to talk about? The line. The line, and the line is the border. The line is the border of how far your set of beliefs go before something else starts. Okay? They're what I would call the talking points and the places for change to happen. So there's the bond, there's a set of beliefs, a person, there's a boundary, how far I go, how I don't go, and then that boundary becomes a border where talk needs to happen if there's going to be growth and change, and when there is growth and change, there's a border crossing. Okay? It's a different way of thinking about a dialogue, huh? But let me give you some examples. A married couple, they have bonds, right? Hopefully they have bonds. Okay. They have bonds. They have bonds. They have things that hold them together, qualities, behaviors like love, togetherness, intimacy of different kinds, openness to life, maybe sharing responsibilities, commitment to family. A married couple has a lot that holds them together, hopefully. That's their bonds. Then they have some boundaries, okay, some lines in that set between what they believe and don't believe. They have boundaries like what they're going to let in and what they won't, like another person, right? Okay, so that's an obvious one. We have this love, we have this commitment, we're open to life, but not to someone else being in our marriage in an inappropriate way. It's a boundary, okay? They may have a boundary about how they'll talk to each other, okay? We're going to talk openly, but we're not going to scream, okay? They may have a boundary about how much time they'll spend together. Like, we can't go for a month and never sit down and have a couple hours together. Like, that's the boundary, okay? What we'll do, what we won't do, okay? I was thinking of someone I was talking to yesterday. We'll love and care for our kids from both of our marriages, but we won't butt into the other's relationship with their kid, okay? So they've got something they share in common and then a line, okay? There's a boundary. But then again, those boundaries, where they draw the line, there's going to be some talking points, okay? And the talking points are the tensions, okay? The borders is where we experience the tension. A couple says we're going to spend time together, but now we're going to talk about, well, what do you mean about spending time together? Because this is what I mean about spending time together. They're going to be intimate. Well, this is what you mean about it being intimate. This is what I mean about it being intimate. Okay? So you're clear. There's bonds, there's boundaries, there's borders, which are the talking points. And then, obviously, when you talk with your spouse and you kind of go through that tension, hopefully you have some border crossing where you say, okay, we're going to do this with the money that we were saying we're going to save. You know, you talk those tensions through, you shift. A border, a horizon, a way of looking at things changes. Okay, that's obvious. Parent-child relationship, same thing. You and your kids, you have this great bond of love and respect that live out in different ways. And how about this one? You have a shared belief that the child needs to grow up. Okay. Now the boundary is when the parent will let the boundary is what the parent will let the child do and won't. Okay. What you can do with the car, what's your curfew, what's your internet use, etc. And the child has a boundary too, what I'll tell you, what I won't. Okay? So then what happens? You get to a talking point. Well, Mom or Dad, how couldn't I stay out a little later? couldn't I go a little farther with the car? You talk and talk and talk, that's the border, then there's a border crossing, okay? And I'm going to skip parish groups because I think it's obvious, but what I'm trying to say is that it's helpful in dialogue, and it'll be very helpful, I think, when we get to where we're going this morning, which is the dialogue between faith and culture. I want you to have really clear what are the bonds, what are the boundaries, what are the border questions, and what's a border crossing look like. I was thinking about, on the last one, laws and policies, I was thinking about just everything we're reading about immigration. Okay, so we could say there's a bond. Hopefully there's a certain kind of bond, not a very comfortable bond, but there's a bond in regard to, in the country, there's more or less a bond among people that something needs to be done. We want something to change. The bond is what we have in common. That's what to keep in mind. Where is what we have in common? It's always what we lose in dialogue, what we have in common. Okay? And it has to be the starting point, what we have in common. So with the immigration issue is there's a bond of we believe something needs to be done, and we know that there needs to be a certain kind of protection for people, for the country, et cetera, et cetera. There's some things in common. And then there's some boundaries, and the boundaries have to do with where's the line between how we think we care for people and how I think we should care for people, how you think we should care for people. We have differences. Part of dialogue is let's listen to the differences. How the bonds is how we're similar, the boundaries is how we're different, okay? And then there's the border, the talking points, and that's what we're continuing to refine, and we're trying to say, how do you keep a country and its citizens treated in a way that's fair and just, okay? Now, there's the tension. What you think is fair, what I think is fair. What you think is just, what I think is just. Where are we? Isn't it interesting? I'm using this example. We're on the border. The most difficult border is not necessarily the border between Mexico and the United States. The biggest border is the horizon that we have in our heads and in our eyes and in our minds about what's fair and what's not. What you think is fair and what I think is fair is a difficult border to negotiate, a much more difficult, I mean, the Mexico border, you just swim across it, you know? Although then you get to the other side and there's all sorts of dangers. But you know what I'm saying? It's just helpful to think about there's these borders, there's these tension places, there's a place where we gotta meet, and we've got to talk on the border. And if we can talk in a spirit of true dialogue, hopefully we experience a border crossing. And actually, no matter what you think of the immigration bills that have been up in Congress, just that we're even there is a sign of a border crossing. We may go back across the border, but there's been some border crossing that we're even there. Does that make sense? Okay, so I don't want to belabor it too much, but I want it all to sink in because we're going to take that to our exercise later in the morning. Yes. So the borders are dangerous places. Because when you get to the border, that's where the rubber meets the road, and people come to the border with a stone. People come to the border with the stone. And that's very, very scary. And so what happens? We all stay away from the border. There are no border crossings if we don't go to the border. In a marriage, you can have all this loveliness, and you can know what's different between you and your spouse. But what happens when you don't go to the border and talk things out? The not going to the border creates violence. So that's a marriage. In a parish, in our churches, we can be together and pray about all we love and believe. That's our bonds. And we can know what's different about us that in one tradition than another. But if we don't go to the outside of our tradition or to the extent of our tradition, which says, get here, and we avoid talking with other groups because it feels dangerous. Either it feels dangerous emotionally or it truly is dangerous, we never get here. And that's probably the most important thing I think we are trying to say is that in the process of dialogue, you've got to move from one to the other, the other, the other. But you never go to the border alone. I mean, in a marriage, you go to the border alone. But you don't. You go to that place of difference, that place of conflict with your spouse, that place of conflict with your parish group. You go with clear thinking, you go with the sense of the Holy Spirit, you go with the sense of your tradition, hopefully you go with people with shared values, and hopefully you go to that border between where the conflict is between one group in a parish and the other with dialogue skills and discernment skills. You can go with rocks, or you can go with dialogue skills and discernment skills and community and prayer and a deep dependence on the power of the Spirit. Okay? Okay. So I'm going to just now break each of these open just in a few sentences. So down to bonds, because it'll make more sense even as we go on. So just stick with me when we come to the exercise we're going to do on faith and culture. So, okay, so we're saying if you want to be involved in a dialogue, which is necessary for growth and to allow God to make room for God to create us new, to create us fuller. There's got to be a sense of, first, of self, of personhood, okay? So for the individual, one's bondedness, the set of beliefs or your personhood, is formed through a number of things. Ben said yesterday, and I love that, he says, who you are is the facts about you, what you've been through, your history, and all the potential, all the more that you are, and what you're going to be. That's a whole sense of who we are as persons. Also, the bonds within an individual means that you have a sufficient degree of trust, okay, that the world's not against me. You have a certain sense of autonomy, like it's okay for me to be separate from everybody else. You have a sense of initiative. I can do things. You have a sense of industry. I can do some things well. I have some competencies. And you would recognize that, some of that language from Erik Erikson, that when you have some sense of trust, autonomy, initiative, you feel like you're somebody, okay? That's what we're talking about so far, identity. Now, not a particular identity yet. For teenagers, young adults into early adulthood, they have an identity. But what we mean by that is they have a sense that they're somebody. Now, who that somebody is still to be developed. But there's enough driver to go someplace. Does that make sense? That's how I like to think of it. At this stage, when we talk about identity, is we're forming in our young adult years. Now I'm a driver. So interestingly, that's when kids start to drive, huh? But that driver now has to, I'm going to skip this for a minute, that driver now has to go into different pieces of their development. How they're going to be in relationships. They have to explore that. They have to explore who they are sexually, what kind of relationships they are going to have, who they are religiously, what kind of Catholic or Episcopalian or spiritual person they're going to be, who they are as an Italian, as an Irish, as a Vietnamese person. You see what I'm saying is when we're talking about identity, we're certainly not talking about it in the limited way that psychology might lead you to believe. It's not saying that anyhow, but it's saying identity, when you hear it, is the beginning of a driver. And then the driver goes into different areas of life. Does that make sense? Okay. And that driver, who's a somebody, exploring all these things, how I'm going to be as a person of faith in community and all of that, how good a driver you are, that influences how you participate in being generative, leaving and developing things for others, and how you integrate what happens in life, okay? And I had an example of that, but it went out of my head, okay? Father Nesty has been using the phrase a couple times that one's identity status, he uses the word identity, status can be diffuse, like I don't really know who I am, and so I'm just lost, or it's foreclosed, I've decided this is who I am, Or I've got one foot in and one foot out. I haven't quite decided. I've chosen some things, but I'm still doing all this. He uses the example. Some people someone might say, I'm married, but then they're still roaming around, okay? This is who I am, but there's no closure. They're still experimenting, okay? Or achieved. It's just one of the phrases that we often talk about in identity. But I don't want to confuse that with the fact that there's some degree of identity, and if your identity isn't more achieved, meaning you've learned to drive, then it's hard to get into the next phase of identity development, which is the exploration of all those areas, okay? One of the ones that I did not put down here is a piece of our self-portrait, who we are, is our interests. Okay? Now that's an area in my life I have not developed very well, at least the area of interest in terms of what's fun, what do I like to do. I think a lot of my identity was you're the helper, which would be a bit of a foreclose. That's who I am, I'm the helper, and I've had to learn I'm more than a helper. I had to kind of improve my driving skills. I'm a somebody. You know, I'm not just a helper, I'm a somebody. And that somebody is exploring all these different areas. But I remember in terms of interest, for years I went hiking with the group, and different people would pick where we were going every year. And after about 10 years of actually some very nice trips, I said, you know, every year somebody picks where we're going. I never pick where we're going. And they said, well, where would you like to go? And I thought, I don't know. Well, you know, my interest, my sense of things, it's all new. And this is going to be very important. Again, it'll click more, I think, as I continue on. But it's like there are just parts of us that are not as developed as others. And there's parts of us that continue to need more and more development. And the ability to develop those, like the ability to learn what it means to be a Catholic, or learn what it means to be an Episcopalian, and explore that, and explore what it means to be a person of faith, and explore what it means to be a political person. A lot of that has to do with how good a driver you are in the first place. Does that make sense? So how strong your sense of personhood is affects how well you can explore these other areas. Otherwise, those other areas become your identity. Does that make sense? If I don't know I'm a driver, then I go into a religious field, I am that role. You know, we're talking a little bit sometimes about clergy. It's like, if there's not enough identity, you get into one of these other areas and it substitutes for personhood. You know, sometimes women would say, didn't develop enough of my identity, I became a mother, or I became a wife. So it's a wonderful thing. But what the woman is often saying is, something has been missing for me because I haven't felt enough of me, the driver, in that. I've just known myself, the role. So anyhow, I just throw all that out there to say, when we're talking about identity, it includes having a driver and knowing if your driver is very good or not. And then we need to have a driver who's willing to drive into many different areas and drive carefully, but continue to drive further into it if you want your identity to develop and get stronger in those areas. And so I just sum it up by saying something Ben said yesterday is, this is the evolving I am, the little I, okay? So that's the bonds for an individual. One other way of thinking of it, some of you probably remember this from your Psychology 101 classes, and that is, we are all people who are developing. We're growing in our sense of identity and who I am. And I use this a lot in marriage preparation with the couples who are getting married. And I say, you know, right now, you just feel like you really know each other and you really love each other. I said, right now you're in, there are things about myself that I know and you know. I said, but you know, as time goes on, I said, I'm sure as you're sitting there are things that you know about yourself that your partner doesn't know, that you haven't shared. And that's all the times when, you know, you're trying to get couples to say some of the things that they're afraid that their fiance wouldn't like. I said, and then, you know, you may not know it, but your fiance knows things about you that you don't know about yourself. They see you. You don't know you have a temper. They know you have a temper, okay? And then there are things about you individually that no one knows yet. And so, like, I like to think, when I'm here, I think, I know things about myself that you know about me. I believe in the Center for Faith and Culture. I like the team. My faith is important. You know that. There's things I know about me that you don't know, and that is how totally anxious I am all the time. Now, you might say, well, Maureen, we know that about you, and you don't know we know it. Okay? And then there's a part of me like, I don't know who I am when I'm dealing with things that never even came up in life. This mystery part is our shadow. And in your shadow is both the dark side of things, like the ways I can be petty and small that I never even realized, the way that I can be jealous or angry or swear like a sailor in prayer. Who'd have thought that, you know? But things that I didn't know about myself, because not just because I was in denial, the river denial, as Cynthia would say, but things in life have not happened that are going to reveal things to me about myself. So that's why we're always in that sense of being kind of surprised by who we are, and that's a good thing if we don't run away from it. So all of that's just about being an individual and how important all that is to be awake. Here's the point, to be awake in dialogue. You got to know who you are. You got to know something about your driver. You got to know where you are in exploration of like different caverns. And you've got to know that others are going to know things about you don't know, and be open to that, okay? So that's what it might mean for the individual. For the Catholic community, we have bonds. And Father Nesti touched on these, that we have something that holds us together. Our belief in the great truth of communio, that we are made for relationship, and that God as Trinity is the model for our lives. God who is in love in the Trinity. The mystery that we are bonded together by a sense of mystery and mission, of covenant, church, dignity of the human person, grace as mediated. Tom shared with us a little bit as the body of Christ what we share and have in common in terms of a church of memory and a church of transcendence. And one of the things that Father Nesti brought this word and thought to my attention is, sometimes when I think about being a member of Catholic community, I used to think, I'm a member of the Catholic community because I love Catholic social teaching. He said, be careful, that could be sectarianism. I'm part of the group because I like this one piece. I'm part of the group. If I'm part of the group, I'm called to explore and learn to embrace all of it. I can't just love one piece, just identify with one piece, okay? And so if bonds are the little I am, bonds for the individual is the I am, then the bonds of the community is the way we say we are, okay? And there needs to be an I am and a we are for a dialogue. All of this is leading up to the foundation for having a good dialogue. Got to have bonds, okay? Then you got to have some boundaries. Oh, I borrowed this from Johari. I called it the window opened up. But I think it's important to say that as an individual, I know myself and you know things about me. There's things I know about me you don't know, da-da-da-da-da. But that's also true for us as a community. There's things we know about ourselves, we people of faith, we Catholics, or we Episcopal, things we know. And then there's things we know about ourselves. Do you ever sometimes sit in mixed company, meaning different religions, and you think, oh, there's stuff about the church I would never want to tell you. There's things we know about ourselves that we don't go talking about, or maybe, something we don't feel good about, something we're private about, something we don't address, okay? And then there's things about us as a community that others know, that see, which is why it's important to be in feedback. How does your parish see our parish? How does your Episcopalian community see our Christian community? We think we're so wonderful. You think we're being pretty crummy about that TMO program? TMO, the Metropolitan Organization about Community Organizing, it's a great place where different parish communities of different traditions come together. And I can go there as a Catholic and think, oh, we're doing this and this and this. My Methodist friend can say, Maureen, you and your parish, you're not doing that. Go. They see something about me that I don't see. They see something about us that we don't see, okay? And then, of course, in the community, too, there's a whole sense of mystery evolving. So just talking about there's a movement in identity, okay, that we want to keep in mind. Okay. And then there's boundaries. There's an awareness of limits. I've already talked about that. Boundaries point to other space or your space, not to my space. Okay, using the language of the day. All the young people are saying, I got my space. Hey, that's good. And what do you usually say when you hear about all the people involved in MySpace? Oh my gosh, scary. Okay, what's scary about it? The stuff that's out, no boundaries, right? There's no boundaries. We're talking about boundaries, and yet we've got kids out there, young people saying, I'm just doing my space. You think, don't for a minute think it's your space. It's everybody's space. There's no boundaries. It's scary, huh? But we're going to get to how do we try to dialogue with that, especially when we're scared, huh? So boundaries is looking at our space, your space. For the individual, I'll give an example of boundaries for the individual, for the community. How many of you know the movie Moonstruck? Love the movie Moonstruck, okay? How to say? There's a young woman, she's widowed, she meets a guy, she falls in love with the guy's brother when she's supposed to be engaged and to marry the first brother. So she falls in love with this fiance's brother. Anyhow, there's a subplot in all that. And what's going on, Olivia Dukakis, I think that's her name. Yeah, she's having dinner. She's the mother of the girl who's involved in this messy relationship of being in love with brother. Olympia Dukakis is sitting in a restaurant, and she has this hunch that her husband is having an affair. And in the meantime, in the restaurant, the Grand Ticino, the restaurant, there's a professor who throughout the movie you see him having encounters with these different students. He's always pursuing the fountain of youth by taking one of his students out to dinner. Then he insults them in some way during the dinner, and they throw water on him. So all throughout the movie you see him with different girls. Finally, he's had it. These are the different happinesses that Father Nesty was talking about. Maybe I'll be happy here. Maybe I'll be happy here. Maybe if I have a young woman here, I'll be happy. Okay. So he's had it because all this pursuit of happiness is getting him nowhere. So he goes over and sits with Olympia Dukakis. And he's sitting there, and she's sitting alone. Again, she believes her husband's having an affair with someone, which in fact he is. And so she's sitting there, and they start talking back and forth. So now this guy, who's the professor, who's been with all the young girls, he's going to hit on her, right? And he says to her, he says, hey, this is great. This is great. Oh, first he says to her, he says, you're eating alone. And she says, I'm not alone. She doesn't let him get her, and she doesn't feel she's alone. She's sitting there alone, but she's sitting with him, okay? But so he says to her, he says, maybe I could go home with you tonight. And she says, no. And he said, oh, somebody's there? And she says, no, you can't go home with me because I know who I am. It's a great line. It's a great line. And she says, and besides, I'm too old for you. But it's a great line. It's the idea of being in a situation where you're being pursued, but there's a calmness because you know who you are. It's like saying, a friend of mine had taken a class on communication and nonviolence. And so we're both very, very careful, and I don't always do it as well as I would like, that you don't spend time talking about somebody. And when you do, you've crossed a boundary. You know, and ever since taking that, I catch myself, I've crossed a boundary. I wasn't going to do that. That's not who I am. You know, maybe for some of you it's, you know, foul language, or some of you it's, you know, what movies you're watching. There's a boundary. Individuals need to have boundaries, because when you have a boundary, you're saying, this is who I am. And like the woman in the movie, clarity about who we are, okay? For the community, we have a boundary. We believe that the bread and wine is the body and blood of Christ. We don't think it's just a symbol. It's a symbol, but it's real, okay? So there's, the whole idea is you got to have boundaries. I think I've made that point, and I don't want to mush it to death. So boundaries are acknowledging we're distinct and different from each other, and they're very, very important. Okay? Mm-hmm.
I understand and agree exactly with what you're saying about the boundary part, but when we gossip, we're stripping that person of their dignity and their right to be.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yeah. And I think, Elizabeth, that's what we want to build up to. We have boundaries not to be rigid. We have boundaries because there's things we believe and don't believe. Okay? And so a lot of times, even I think in the whole question about our faith tradition, we want to be inclusive. We believe that, but then we're not defined. We don't say this is what we believe and don't believe. It's like one value is making it harder sometimes to reflect another value, and that's something that needs to go to the border for a conversation. Okay, right, sit at the border. Okay, so borders again, the talking places and spaces where change can take place, a place of difference, tension, crisis. It's a liminal space. You hear that word more and more and probably use it yourself. The borders are the liminal space or transition place that are meant to be, Barbara should have meant to be, open, characterized by openness, humility, and I love this word, and indeterminacy. And here's the point about all this that I'm going on and on about. You can't be indeterminate about who you are with a basic identity. You can't be indeterminate about some of what you believe and don't believe. But you've got to take that self with some clarity to the border and there let yourself be in a place of unknown, okay, so that something can change. One of the scriptures I love so much and think about often from John's Gospel is when Jesus says, "Nobody takes my life from me. I give it freely. I lay it down, I take it up again." You know, we call him the victim. He doesn't call himself the victim. You know, and I love that. I think about that a lot. You know, because sometimes like, oh, someone's making, I have to do this today, and I have to do that today. No, you don't, Maureen. Choose. You know, no, you don't. Either do it or don't do it. So that there has to be, and I guess the point of all this is, there's got to be some clarity of what you believe. There's got to be some clarity about what you don't believe, and then you've got to be willing to go to the edge of that and talk about what's unknown, knowing there's always a border where what you know and believe has to be discussed, because how else will God bring about a new horizon for us individually, as communities, and for the world? And so I like to think of it, going back to what we talked about today, the last couple of days, it's the place where we can be interfered with. Okay? It's the noonday sun. It's where the woman at the well goes to the well in the noonday sun, and something can happen there, and her horizon about herself, her relationships, and her place in life changes. It's the womb and the tomb of Jesus, where we're open to something change. But this doesn't happen without there first being some boundaries and some bonds. Otherwise, this is just a diffuse state if you start just at borders, okay? Right, and last, not least, and so then what we're talking about, there's talking places and spaces where change can take place, the place of different tensions, crisis, I think we did that one, Cynthia. Okay, next one. It's the place where I'm out of control. Okay, so the border crossing then is the place where we are moved beyond our original way of thinking, believing, and we go to a changed horizon. It's the place where and when we are able to cross borders in a responsible, dialogical way, and we have a new experience of communio. Okay, you know when you have a hard dialogue with one of your kids, or you have a hard dialogue with your spouse, or you have a difficult dialogue with a parish community to another, and you really stay at that border. Can you think of times like that where you've been at those borders and had those hard conversations, and when people were respectful and talked, maybe the movement wasn't anything you thought it was going to be, but you had a sense that somehow something was right just in having had the talk. That somehow the presence of something bigger, someone bigger, was there in that conversation with you and your child, you and your spouse, one parish group to another parish group. When you can go to the border, talk respectfully, be open, something starts moving usually, okay? And maybe it's the kind of moving like when women are pregnant, it's a kind of moving that doesn't feel real good, but it's moving, okay? There's a border crossing, there's something being born, okay? And so it goes back to dialogue is not for fixing. It's so that we can come to be more one with the one, but not the same. We retain a lot of our individuality. Okay, last slide. Okay, so dialogue means understanding and listening to who you are, understanding and communicating who I am, acknowledging and conversing on our differences, and then being open to mystery and being changed. Okay? Let me stop there for a minute and just ask you for some reactions. What are you thinking or what are you feeling?
Is this liminal space necessary? The reason I'm asking, I know there's a lot of people that can't be open on a lot of issues that we talked about. I've done business in the Far East before, and I know there's certain things you don't talk about with you. You can't be open. How do you handle that?
So you're saying like with some
Well, let's take one we can't be open. How about birth control? Let's say you're a politician, and the voters are talking about, how do you handle something like that as a liminal space? Is it necessary to go there?
It's necessary to go there if there's going to be change and growth. It's necessary to go to liminal space. Will people, remember, liminal space is the border. Many people won't go to the border. It's going to stay inside their bonds and stay inside their boundaries. That's why I'm doing all this, is to say, what are you going to do? Are you going to stay away from the borders? Politicians stay away from the borders or liminal space all the time. Well, okay, let me say this. It's horrible in the sense it's so damn frustrating. Now, if you're a politician, now we can think of it two ways. We could say, those damn politicians, they won't go to the border. Some politicians won't go to the border. They're afraid if they go to the border, they're going to get hit with a bunch of rocks, and then they won't be able to do any good in any area. But I want you to do good in this area. You know, one of the things that was interesting, I think, in some of the recent elections is Catholics and different groups talking to politicians who are standing on the border in the liminal space trying to talk about like being Democrat but being against abortion. You know, you need a politician needs a whole community behind them to be able to be in their party and out of their party. But you can look at them, but do we go to the borders? Do we go to the liminal space? Do we go to where we feel out of control in a conversation?
Yeah. I've never held office. I know in the party that I
affiliated with, that sometimes we'll tell people, well, we're not going to vote for you unless you promise that no, we're not going to get any judges or this, that, or the other. No, you know, and we put a lot of Roman Catholic and you know, different Christian values on top of these guys.
So you're saying
they're moral people. They can make a good decision.
Sure.
But we're telling them they can't decide.
Right. So you're saying we go to the border with our politicians and we have the hard talks.
Yeah.
But see, I think some groups have done that, and then the politician says, I want to do that, but then probably you're the minority, and I won't win, and so then what do I do? Do it anyhow, just lose. You know, what kind of a response is that? You know, do it anyhow, just lose. That's where the community has to listen and say, okay, what does the person do? The good they can do, they think they'll lose. Now, I'm not trying to be black and white. I'm saying it's a place for conversation. It's a place for ongoing dialogue. But we go to the border. We go ready to have a peaceful conversation. It doesn't go the way we want. And so we pull out our rock or we go back within our group.
Yeah, I think sometimes we are so rushed in going to borders. And we have to really do a lot of research and study, and sometimes we are not aware of all the bonds And because of we have not having the bondedness among the groups, and sometimes we single-handedly go to the border fighting for one particular area we would like to achieve, then sometimes we can endanger ourselves and can endanger that subject too. So I think sometimes it's good to be prudent, to discern, just like Father Nestle often say, to be wise means to know the time of God. And sometimes you have to really research well that area and see whether we can find the group that share the same values, like what you say, and then we can team together and we have to see what do we have to face this area, that cultural force that's basically drawing the clear border to keep us out and not be able to go to the border. So I think it's a lot of discernment, a lot of studying, a lot of reflection. And I think that one of the major important qualifications for us to go there is the sense of self-giving, have to die to ourselves. And a lot of times we go to the border, but just like you said, we have our own agenda. We want to get our agenda, but we don't focus on the growth of the community. And that's, for me, is one of the most dangerous things when we mix the personal agenda with the communal agenda, and we're really using a community to fight for our own personal agenda, and that is dangerous.
Can I just give a very personal example, not my personal, but one that's closer to home?
You get to the border with your spouse or your kid, and you go to the border with a point, and, violence ensues. You yell at each other, you and your spouse, whatever, and nothing happens. I think what Ben is reminding us, then you have to back up to, you went unprepared to the border. You have to go with, now what do we have in common? We have love. We have commitment. And what do I believe and don't believe? I believe love is patient, love is kind, it doesn't put on airs. What do I believe, what don't I believe? Be prepared when you go to the border with your bondedness and your boundaries. Don't just show up at the border.
Related to what Father Ben was saying, what you're just now saying, doesn't that presuppose that there's some room on both sides of the border for either side? But what if you come to a position, and Jim mentioned it, to me, there is no room on the other side, for example, if you're talking with a pro-abortionist or abortion provider, for example. You're trying to have them understand the sanctity of life. I mean, I can't go, I don't see how I can go on the other side of the border. So how do I do that?
Okay. Let me just pick up on something. Maybe I'm being narrow here, but you said you went to the border because you're trying to get them to understand the sanctity of life.
I'm probably taking that out of context, Mike, but when you go because you have a message, that's good. But the thing is to ask them, and I know you know this, but I'll just spell it out as an example, why is that important to you? Why is the position important to you? Why is abortion acceptable in your mind? And not just say it, because then I want to tell you how to think. Tell me. See, that's what it means. It's, the border is so complex, right? And all that means. It's so complex, but we go with a belief that we cherish and we hammer it on somebody instead of we go holding it, just like Jesus did. I come holding this belief, offering it to you. Tell me why. Tell me why abortion. I'll tell you, of the clients I've had over the last 18 years, many of the ones who were for abortion had so many familial reasons that made them take that stance. And once I heard that, I thought, well, no wonder you think that way. Now, can we talk some more about that? Can we talk about some other ways of thinking? That's the dialogue at the border. But I think what you're saying is true. It's like the border is the place where we want to pull out our hair. And the border is the place where we got to learn how to sit down, get a margarita, and take this slow.
Down there, being open to mystery and being changed. Am I supposed to be open to being changed on that issue? How can I?
You won't change your issue about the dignity of life, but you will change your view of that person. And that dialogue, and they will no longer be the enemy.
Okay.
And and the whole thing is then after you listen, then you have to say, we'll talk about this a little more in the second part of the afternoon. Can I tell you now my story and why I believe what I believe?
I understand you're for abortion, and I think I have a better understanding why, and I can see why, given how you think and what you've experienced, you would think that. Can I tell you now why I think not? Everything is so precious, and you go on and what the scripture means. So see what I mean? It's all about the depth of your dialogue skills. Then we'll go right.
In talking about dialogue, most of the, when my wife and I are in a session with some people, friends, and we get into a discussion, it's more of a debate. They have a position, and they're defending that position. And so while we're talking, they're thinking of how they can perfect the debate. So that's the typical discussion that we have. But it's a debate rather than dialogue where we're trying to understand the other position. So if we go to the border on a debate format, there's an impenetrable wall there because they're on their side building up their armament, and we're on this side, and the only thing you can do is try to shoot through the wall, but you can't get there.
Right.
You're isolated with an impenetrable wall. So the debate agenda does not work. But it is very common in the kind of discussions we're talking about.
Right.
And doesn't work unless you decide we're going to have a good debate. And that's fine. That's a good thing. But when conversation that's supposed to be sharing and hopefully influencing turns into debate, then the relationships start to deteriorate, right? And so someone has to, and that's what I always think, is somebody has to go first. I always say to my clients, somebody has to go first in coming up with some more love. Either one of you think you can do that? You know, someone has to decide to change the rules, right? So like in your example, Bob, I think it looks like this, to say, instead, we hear something we don't like. And so what do? We start to muster up, you know, our argument. What I'm saying is explore what you don't like, what you're hearing. Explore it. And then ask for the opportunity to share. And at least now we're involved in civil discourse. I know my time's up, but since I'm standing up here, I'm going to take 2 more minutes. This is what comes to my mind. This is what's coming to my mind as I'm listening. I love to think about the scripture. And it's the scripture where, this is what we lay people do who haven't had scripture training like some of the others. We said, it's the one about the scriptures. It's the one about. Jesus has had it. Jesus has had it. He's been walking from town to town with his group. He's had a message that is burning. He is full of fire. He wants so much to see this happen that everyone is treated with dignity. Nobody is living on the borders in a crummy place, ostracized. He has been pouring his life into that, and people don't get it, and he has had it. He's at the temple, and there are the tables, and there's all this materialism, and there's all this irreverence, and there's all this cluelessness, and he had it. He's had it, and what does he do? He starts yelling and throwing up the tables. You're a brood of vipers. Don't you get it? I tell you this, I tell you that, you don't get it. Kind of reminds you of yourself sometime, right? And then what someone pointed out to me years ago, after that just losing it episode, the very next passage, he sits down and he starts sobbing. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, all I wanted to do was love you. And that, you know, so when I'm so like, oh, I'm trying to do this, don't you know I'm trying to do this? Don't we're trying to make a good church? It's like, no, I guess it's not getting through, and maybe it's because I'm yelling, you know. And that it's really a lot of grief. A lot of times when we're yelling, not always, but a lot of the time, it's a lot of grief. And our grief needs to be grieved so that we can stand up like he did, wipe the tears from our eyes, and get to pick up what we're here for, which is to love, which is to love, which is to learn about love, which is to bring love, which is to experience love. Let's have a break then, okay? I said to my group last night, my team, I said, you know, I always get distracted when I hear that phrase, a dialogue between faith and culture. Like, how do do you dialogue with a culture? You know? And what came to my mind, because a culture seems like a big rock, you know? But I was thinking about this item you can find in magazines now or at stores, where you know how they have these hollowed out rocks that go over like a stump or go over, or what are they called? Yeah, fake. Yeah. Right, you can hide a key in them. And I thought, you know, these rocks are hiding a bunch of people. There's people that represent these rocks. And of course, we're the rock a lot of times. We're part of that. And so my very literal brain, my brain is so literal, sometimes it truly frightens me. But dialogue with faith and culture means dialoguing with people and dialoguing with the values that people are holding that are coming from the group and values the groups have adopted, okay? And we're part of that. So that when we have a dialogue with faith and culture, we remind ourselves we're dialoguing with people, okay, who are carrying a value, and a lot of times we're that person. But if you look at the questions that we have here, this is the exercise we'd like to bring into focus. We'd like you to look at the rock that you have and choose one of the cultural forces that you wrote down on that rock. And we want you to get a dialogue going between that cultural force and your Catholic voice, okay? So to do that, you might have to answer these questions. Who would be involved in the dialogue? Who are you talking to when you talk about materialism? Who are you talking about when you talk about overemphasis on beauty? Who are you talking about, and what are you talking about? We talk about the rapid pace of things. How can you imagine that force lived out in people, and who carries it that you could talk to about it, okay? How would you prepare or begin? You know, it kind of touched on that. What would you need to get clear in your own mind or minds together before you begin? What do you want to understand, okay? Then this is now using your imagination. What might you hear? And what would you want to say? I'm trying to get you to imagine a dialogue now and write out a dialogue. What could come from the dialogue? What resistance might you expect? And how could you or would you keep the dialogue going? I'll give you a real quick example. Last night I was talking to a friend of mine who's a pastor. He had a couple people calling him that two of the young girls in the parish had been involved on a MySpace deal and were spreading very, very ugly, vulgar comments about another girl in their class. And so even the priest said, Maureen, I'm not going to tell you what the words were and what the girls were saying was terrible. So the youth minister said, Father, you need to talk to these girls about this. And the youth minister had already talked to the girls about it and said, this is terrible. This is this. You know, this is, you know, we don't believe this. And just really trying to come down on these girls for doing such an ugly, offensive, mean-spirited thing to another girl. So this priest friend of mine says, I'm working out my strategy for the meeting. So I love this. It's just what we're talking about. He called them in and he said very calmly, I understand y'all have been doing some emailing, he says, and that, and he had the emails there. He said, I have the emails there. He says, and I don't understand. I don't understand, and I want to see if you can help me understand. You know, and the parents are going, don't call that girl and tell her to quit that and kick her out of the church and out of the country and all that. He starts off with, I've got this and I don't understand. He says, can you help me? Like, what was going on in you that would prompt you to do this? And of course, you know, and those are your parents. You do that with your kids. You've got good skills at home. Can you take it to the border of the parish and the community? Mm-hmm. So what would make it, and of course they started a long story of, you know, she did this and we were mad and da-da-da-da-da-da-da. So he said, he's listening, empathizing. So you were angry and, you know, this happened. And yes, yes, yes. Yeah, and so he did it. Yeah, yes, yes. He says, well, then I can understand. well, excuse me, then I can understand why you're really angry. He says, is there anything else you can tell me about this and why you did? It goes back to what Meg said. Is there anything else you can tell me? And then they come up with another thing. And then they come up with another thing. And so he's there, he says, I'm going to be 70. I'm getting old. He says, okay. He says, okay. He says, and then he says, I appreciate your telling me. Now, how many of us want to tell some young people who have used terribly vulgar language, I appreciate you telling me your story? But what is he doing? He's trying to foster relationship. He's trying to witness to love. He says, so now can I tell you something? And the girls say, are you going to tell us you're mad at us, Father? He said, I'm trying not to. I'm trying not to. He says, I am angry, and can I tell you why? Which, of course, the other person is much more likely to let you tell them why if you sat through their why, right? And again, I know you know this. It's, can we take this dynamic that you do in your homes, if you've learned the highway, to the public arena, to the encounter of social issues? And he says, I'm angry, and I want to tell you why I'm angry. He said, you girls are precious. Not the girl you beat up on emotionally, mentally. You girls are precious. He says, I know you when you were this and this. Says, I just see something in you that is so precious. He starts telling them stories. They start crying. I remember when you did this. I remember when you made your first Holy Communion. I remember, just like the Lord, does not forget our dignity. I remember when you did this and this. He says, and to be ugly or unkind is not you. It is not you. And so all I can guess is that you have these strong feelings you don't know what to do with. And so we're going to talk to the youth minister and have a class on how do you deal with your anger. He says, we're going to do that. He says, and I also think like you're going with the crowd. You think you're being outside the crowd. He says, we Catholics believe that when you go into violence, you're going with the crowd. And we don't go with that crowd. We've got our own crowd. Beautiful conversation. And so what happens? They go home, they tell their mothers. The mother calls the youth minister to tell the youth minister he was wrong for having talked the way he did. He should have talked like Father talked, and it all started all over again. Then we're back on the emails, and it's like, is that not like our lives? Is that, so what's my priest friend going to do? Put his head in the toilet or go to bed, have a good night's sleep, and start again tomorrow? And that's the Soma. And so that's the story of our lives. That's the story of our lives. But was it a success? Was it a success? It was a wonderful success story. But does it mean it's not done? Yes, it means it's not done. Okay, so it's just a little example. So we don't have time. I handed out the intentional dialogue sheet, and it's a real simplistic form, and it kind of touches on what Maggie said about the listening. But Father Nesty said yesterday, he says, we always focus on the listening. Why don't we focus on the talking? How do you do the talking? And I was thinking that's true, because you know how all of us, we've gone to classes and we're going to practice listening. And you get your couples there, and so they're going to practice. And so one of the spouses says, I just think that you're this and this and this and this and this and this and this. And you say, now practice listening. That sometimes it's so.
Does everybody have that, the intentional dialogue?
The intentional dialogue? Yeah, just not y'all. Y'all are left out. But you know what I'm saying is, I just think everyone knows how to listen. It's just a matter of committing ourselves to doing it. Okay, you go. But if you look at the other side, we also, most of us can use some practice, and maybe we need as much practice or more practice on I statements and how to self-disclose. So you want to think in this exercise about what is it you want to express? Why is it important to you? What is important to you? Why is it important to you? What are you hoping or wanting on this issue? What would that look like? Are there past events, present or future, affecting your desire? How can you express all of the above in an I statement rather than a you statement? Okay? And I hope that my little story about my priest friend kind of illustrated lots of listening and then good I statement, good disclosure. So those are just some reminders as you now do this exercise of a dialogue with faith and culture. So just be creative and go at it, and then we'll have fun sharing each group and talking about it.